Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Yeah, it's 4 o'clock, so I guess we'll get started. I don't know if Dave's going to join us or not. Do we want to go down the thing and announce ourselves?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I am Dane Pasty from WatchersOnTheWall.com. Some of you may know my contributions there. My real name is Tina, so you can call me either. And it's pasty as in meat pie, not pasty as an Englishman. Okay. And no insult to English people. I am English of English descent. So, in my real life, I'm a computer programmer. I consider myself a feminist from way back in the day. I love Game of Thrones. That's why I'm here. So.
I'm Michal Schick. I am a senior writer at Hypable.com, where I cover Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, anytime George writes something interesting on his blog. And I also podcast a bunch of different places, but specifically about Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire at the Vassals of Kingsgrave. And on the internet, I'm also known as Ink as Rain.
I'm Jessica Neftali. I'm a filmmaker, and I also do Game of Thrones recaps over on the Fandomentals.
I'm Jamaica Knott. Despite my shirt, I have no association with Watchers on the Wall, unfortunately. I am just...
Not yet.
I'm just a big fan who was honored to be asked to be a part of a panel. And this is the one I chose because it's important. In my real life, I am a feminist, big progressive. I'm a born and bred New Yorker, so I tend to be like, yeah, yay! New York in the house, yay!
Sorry, I have to high-five you.
Yeah. Sweet. All right.
New York
And I'm a little nervous, so if you hear me sort of in the background, it's because I'm like a little nervous. So.
Okay. So do we want to start with questions, or do we want to bring up topics?
Why don't we start with saying our favorite female warriors in the world? Because that's what the panel's called.
Just show-wise, I'm going to just stay with show-wise. Brienne, of course. Yeah, she's my girl.
Yeah, I'd have to say Brienne. I'm not as fond of her in the show as I am in the books, because in the books she's such a simultaneous pacifist and warrior at the same time, and is such a complex blend. In the show, she's just kind of like, I strong, I kill. But she's still unusual, and Gwendolyn Christie is wonderful in portraying her. So.
Yeah. In the show, I guess I would also say Brienne. If I was saying earlier seasons, I would probably say Arya. And in the books, I really like Asha Greyjoy.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm gonna go for the trifecta here, and it's probably also Brienne on the show. In the books, I love Asha, but I'm also a big fan of the actual Sand Snakes.
Yeah.
The Dorne, the real Sand Snakes, the ones in the book.
The only Sand Snakes.
Who are, who are strong and open-minded and opinionated and fierce fighters. So they're great.
Yeah.
Do we have any least favorites?
Depends on what
Least
you
favorite
mean.
warriors? Least favorite warriors of the females? No, I mean I think all the female. I mean, because even of the spear wives who we know of are pretty cool. So you don't really see them much on the show. Other than Ygritte, who is sort of a spear wife, I guess, and technically, but for what they're supposed to be, she was a spear wife. But I don't really have a disfavorite of the female warriors. No.
Yeah, I feel like the term least favorite also gets a little bit confusing here, because I think the reason why I don't like a lot of the ones on the show now is just because of how they're written, not necessarily where the characters are coming from. So if I feel like if I say least favorite, that just means I don't like them, but that's not the case.
And who's your least favorite?
All I can see in my head now is the Sand Snakes. I'm a little wary of them in the books because they are such a wild card, and you can tell that they're just going to do exactly what they want to do. But that's not that's just a personal taste thing. But yeah, in the show, I was really disappointed at they basically just popped all the sand snakes in a blender and then poured out what came out into 3 different glasses. It was one a whip, one a spear, one a whatever.
Yeah.
With little daggers.
I don't, I can't say I have a least favorite female warrior in the show really. In the books, I would say Ariane. It's Ariana. I can't remember her name now, but yeah, I don't really have a least favorite, to be honest with you. And as far as let's just address the elephant in the room, okay? The difference between books and show. The beauty of the books is that you get into their heads, right? But with acting, you get the dialogue and you get the expression on their face, and that's it. So it is really like you can say you love Brienne, but you don't really know Brienne until you've read the books, to be honest with you. And so in all the characters, just being in their head, I'm a book reader first, right? Like most of us are. And so getting that psychology and the thinking is really what makes you love a character, I think. And so for me, it's like I love Brienne, and it's hard for me to separate the show character from the book character, which means she's done a good job. They've done a good job with her, I think. When you can definitely draw a line between the characters in the book and the show, then and with like the Sand Snakes, then yeah, there's probably a problem. But so that's my reasoning there.
I think that's a good point for us to go into, is talking about book versus show for some of these. And I feel like we all have a lot of really strong feelings about Brienne because we love her so much. Maybe we should start with Brienne. I guess the point could be because you mentioned that obviously I don't think there's like a crazy distance between book and show. Like we still have enough there that we can, like I still feel like Gwendoline Christie feels like Brienne when I see her sometimes, but where do you feel like there's been the most disassociation in terms of adapting her?
I mean, I wonder if a lot of it comes from the fact that the show is written 98% by men. And maybe that's not fair to say because the books are written 100% by men.
Depends on the man.
That's true. But I mean, like with Game of Thrones, it's like a little embarrassing. Like they had 2 women on the writing staff ever on like 2 seasons, and that was it.
Yeah, TV is worse because
one at a time.
It is a writer's room, so you have the complete ability to bring in other voices and other perspectives, and they just don't.
Yeah. That aside, I mean, I tend to think that they value brawn over finesse, I guess you could say. Right. Like Asha is in the books. She has incredible finesse. She's a tactician and a fighter at the same time, and she has that edge that is both ruthless and very thoughtful at the same time. Like first time I read the books, I did not understand Asha, and then I went back and was like, oh my God, you're awesome. You're thinking about stuff. You want to change things. This is amazing. She's obviously not a complete revolutionary, but she doesn't find any joy in killing somebody who is not equally willing to fight and kill her. So I think that on the show, a lot of that gets lost. I think that Yara on the show is a lot more, not to turn this into the Yara discussion, but like, I think it is of a piece. Like Brienne kind of shows her strength in the show through killing. Like one of the first times we meet her is like she kills those soldiers who were hanging the whores at some point. And
yeah, she just like cuts people down, no question, on the show without.
Yeah, and her
any
killing
thought.
Stannis was like. I mean, there's so many problems with that, but that's, I don't believe it's ultimately a Brienne thing to do. Like it's not like. We have, in the books, when she kills, it's out of necessity, and it's something that happens to her, not something that she seeks out.
Yeah, her first kill is like a huge, important
It's
moment.
a big deal. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
On the show, she's more of an executioner.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's not who she is in the books.
Yeah. It's basically the Arya model, right?
It's all of them. I think that's probably where we're going to go a lot with all of these, is I think that the show writers just have a completely different read on what the thematic concept of the books is in terms of the futility of violence and why it's used and how it's not something to be proud of or necessarily show off. But I think that the way that they write all of their characters, not just the women, but specifically the women, that's where they do the opposite, and that's where they find their strength is in.
They tend to get rid of, at least in terms of the female warriors, I think they lose, I hate to use this term, but their femininity for the most part, and because they do tend to approach everything from a very nihilistic, violent sort of standpoint. And when you're reading it from their point of view, with Asha, with Brienne, even with Arya, there's this sense of, like emotion to it that gets lost on the screen, that they don't seem to have this sense of, like with the whole Brienne thing, like the first time you see her kill somebody on the show, she's still with Jamie, and she just sort of cuts them down like with no real sort of thought about it, and it was like almost natural to her, whereas opposed to in the books, she goes through a lot of things before she kills her first person, and it was in self-defense to protect somebody else, and it had such a huge impact on her, and just the dichotomy of it, like how that affected her in the book version of her versus the show version of her, where she had like sort of no emotion. It was just a natural thing to do. That's where they sort of lose the human touch to it. And I think they do that even with a lot of their male fighters. So that's probably where I'd say, like, they do it with their female. They've done it with Arya. They do it with Yara versus Usha type of thing. You know, the Sand Snakes were basically just blood sport and killing, and so it's, you know, they tend to lose a sense of humanity, I think, and it just becomes a straight, you know, sort of butchering thing.
And I think it's really interesting you use the word femininity, because I think with Brienne it's specific, and with Arya, the show tends to be really dismissive of femininity and finding it not strong to be female, or not strong to be feminine in the way that it's coded to be feminine. And that's a huge another difference between Brienne in the show and Brienne in the books for me, is that Brienne finds strength in being a woman. She knows that she feels displaced in the society as being a woman in terms of what she wants out of it, but she sees so much strength in someone like Kat, and that relationship was always really interesting, versus on the show we get so many like insults and like throwaway lines of like, oh, you're such a woman, and all of these dismissive comments. Arya does it all the time in terms of her relationship with Sansa, even after she's supposed to have grown past that. And I think it's because the show never saw femininity as being a strength-defining feature. Like Arya in the first season even, I love how she's written, but she's supposed to be the outsider. We're not necessarily supposed to see the stuff she's doing as being normalized or cool in the society, but they still kind of always wrote it that way because I think that's what they found cool, versus someone like Sansa.
I think that's one of the great shames about the Sand Snakes, is that they use what's called soft power. And in the books, you know, they're not just, can't just slice your throat. They can seduce you, manipulate you,
right.
and use the traditional soft power that women do. But they have the full range, and they're okay with that. And one of the reasons why they're so multidimensional in that fashion is because they weren't raised in a patriarchal culture. The Dorne culture accepts women fully, and so they're allowed to be sexual and murderous, right? Whereas Brienne, being raised in a very patriarchal culture, is, you know, she can only be one extreme or the other. She has to be asexual and masculine, violent, or she's going to be feminine and marry and pump out babies, right? So she's got to choose. It's forced on her. But the Sand Snakes don't have to make that choice. You know, they get to be whoever they are. And I think the true same for Arya. You see that in her choice. You know, she's like, I don't want to be some wife in some castle sitting around bored doing bad stitching. I want to, you know, go out there and see the world and do things. And so that's I think that was an interesting thing that actually was successful to show, is that the way the women turn out in Dorne versus, you know, how they would turn out. And I always have this mental exercise where I think, how would Brienne be different had she been raised in some place like Dorne? Right? Think about that.
Oh, that's sad to think about.
Think about.
Right.
It is,
It's sad.
actually.
It's sad because she would have
All
been
that
so much
self-loathing
more.
would be gone.
Yeah, because there's also there's always that one quote with Bran that I find really defining, is when she's talking about how she was betrothed to someone when she was younger, I think like 7, and then that person died, and she talks about what that life would have been had they survived. She would have had his babies and not been able to do what she's doing now, but like there would be a safety in that. And she talks about how it makes her sad that that was the circumstance that allowed her to be in this place, but she's also glad that it led her here because this is what her identity is. And I always find that so interesting, because there's a complexity there with her understanding and respecting that that's a role that some people can have. And it's why she respects Kat so much, because she finally sees a strength in someone taking that typically coded role in a completely different way, but at the same time respects that that's just not who she is.
Yeah, Doesn't she have a line, something about Lady Catelyn being a warrior in her own right or
In
something?
her own
right,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's interesting how like you take somebody like Asha in the book, her, you know, she's still a warrior. She's still respected. She captains her own ship. Men follow her. People believe in her. But when it comes time to who's going to rule, like some people are like, well, yeah, of course she should rule, and others are like, well, no, she's a woman, and that's her only disqualifier is that she's a woman. And so she herself also, despite being the most qualified person, loses out to somebody who's like completely inappropriate for the job. So we've
That would
seen
never
happen.
happen
We know
in
how that
real
turns
life.
out.
Where's
So-
that happened?
Yeah, so we sort of had a precursor to the nightmare we're all living now, but it's
Oh
so
my God.
it becomes a, you know, she's still someone who's a warrior, who's respected, and she still has to sort of fight these patriarchal, you know, fights that women in Dorne don't necessarily have to fight, and yet she even still, like, you know, has a sense of humanity to her, and like, you know, we're not just going to go out and rape and pillage and do this and do that, because we can do more than that.
Unless
saves
you're
the Glover's
Yara.
baby.
Unless you're Yara.
Well, she,
And then so she's, you know, things happen to her in the books that haven't happened to her in the show, but, you know, she's still sort of stuck in this, you know, they try to marry her off to, you know, somebody she clearly doesn't want to get married to. They do it in absentia, and you know, she becomes a prisoner, and all sorts of things happen to her. And she's just still this fierce woman who's, you know, still planning, still worried about her brother, still wants to protect her brother, still wants to protect her people. And, you know, despite everything that's happening, is still sort of plotting and planning in her head, like, you know, how am I going to get out of this? What am I going to do? How can I get around this? How do I get around Stannis? How do I get around Euron? How do I get around this, around this? And so she's never been one to just sort of sit back and let stuff happen to her. And so, you know, it sort of ties in with like even like Daenerys, like the people who can be, you know, warriors sort of have to fight battles on two fronts, which is something that, you know, either non-warrior women or men don't necessarily have to
Right.
fight.
I like the way you said get around. That
Yeah.
right. That I don't see men doing. They go through.
Right.
Typically, and that's
Right.
stereotypical. So you know, that doesn't apply to everybody. But they go around. They think if I instead of confronting someone, why don't I just go around them?
Go around, right.
Right,
Like,
yeah.
you know, if there's a way that I can do this without just being a battering ram through the door, there's other ways that I can get to the point that I want to get to.
Right,
So
which
it's the whole like sort of diplomacy versus war thing.
Yeah.
Which is an
kind of
interesting contrast to Cersei, I think,
Right.
because in her own diplomatic and sexual way, she's battering ram very much. So,
Yes.
thing. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
She's a hammer.
Yeah,
She's the
exactly.
hammer, right.
Um,
Which, yeah.
do you have a question?
I had a question. You had mentioned before about the concept of being a warrior in the mind. Who are some of your favorite characters who are not physical warriors, that are not Cersei and Daenerys, that use their minds in just fabulous ways to either get what they want, use their wisdom, calculate, who have had amazing strategies of them? Who are some of your favorites?
Marjorie.
Should we? Yeah.
Marjorie.
Marjorie.
Yeah.
She's
Sansa?
amazing.
Yes,
And Lady
Sansa.
Olenna.
Yeah.
Yep. The Tyrell ladies, basically.
Yeah.
I would say Ariane, she seems to be learning. I don't know if you know who
She's
Ariane
getting there.
Martell is.
I think Ariane's great because her plans don't necessarily work out. I think that's what's interesting about her.
Yeah.
But I don't think she's like, I wouldn't be like, yeah, those plans.
Yeah. But
I'd follow
definitely,
that. But yeah.
definitely the Tyrell ladies, I think, are probably. I would say Sansa, but I don't
Yes,
know if she's.
Sansa.
I don't know if she's there yet. Quite.
I think in the book she's there.
in the book she's there.
In the
book,
show,
she's
I don't
definitely
know what's
there.
happening.
Yeah.
It changes every episode.
So yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
the way
it's. I mean, I thought in the show she had gotten there because when she came down those steps in all black, it just looked like she was
Yeah.
ready. I'm like, all right, she's ready.
And the worst
then
part
she just
is
reverted
the
back, and I was like,
storyline
"Ah."
wouldn't have changed if we just didn't have season 5. It would have made more sense if she just brought the Vale troops from the Vale.
From the Vale, yeah. So
But-
so she's getting there, you know. But she's eventually right. So she's eventually gonna get there, I think.
No, you don't.
She's going to be Marjorie, but probably smarter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't you think that though her and Arya, the way they handled Littlefinger, I mean, she's arrived.
Oh, it was brilliant.
right?
I mean,
Like,
I
'cause
just
I didn't
it's
expect that
frustrating
from
because
My
we didn't
problem
see
with
it
was that
happen.
you
It
didn't
just
see it.
happened.
That was my problem
Right,
with it. Yeah.
you didn't see it.
Like I want to see, like we got no scenes of them together working together, and that's all I wanted from that reunion. And I think
Also,
it's
Littlefinger's plan worked. Like he did divide them. Arya was gonna kill her,
Which
and
is
Sansa
crazy.
was gonna kill her first. And then
Yeah.
They were
I
planning-
don't
No,
I don't think
there's
they did because we
scenes-
didn't see it.
if you
I
listen
think they
to
were planning them the whole time.
I mean, it's hard to tell because they don't contextualize a lot of things in the show. But if you listen to their inside the episodes from the episodes when they were just alone in the room, they were talking about like Sansa's fear of Arya. In those initial scenes, I think the in between moment is a moment we didn't have on the show. They talked
Yeah.
about like cutting a scene where they go to talk to
yeah,
Bran.
Sansa talks to Bran or something. Yeah.
And that's supposed to be like the moment when she then realizes Arya and her are being tricked.
Right.
But those
Yeah.
scenes of them together where Arya's just threatening to skin her face off are indeed real scenes, sadly.
No, but I mean, like honestly, it's not.
She gave her the dagger. She taught her how to play the game of faces, to detect lies. And the next time Sansa talks to Littlefinger and he tries to start pushing her, she sees through him. I think Arya, from the minute she gave him the death glare, I think she knew what she was doing all along. And it was all her acting with no one.
That's true, but the problem is, did Sansa know that? Like
No.
from the beginning, Sansa, and that's the issue.
She couldn't know it, I think.
Yeah.
Because she couldn't fool Littlefinger. If she knew it, he would know that she was up to something.
But see, I
Yeah.
think that's very diminishing of
Saying, oh,
Sansa's
Sansa,
character, right?
right.
Like her whole arc is
Yeah.
becoming this person who is like she's
That's the thing
this
she can do. She
student
can
of
play the
master.
game.
She
Yeah.
should be able to look Littlefinger in the eye and lie, and him not be able to tell.
I mean,
the truth.
she's done it before.
At this point,
That's all
You
she's
know.
done at this point.
Yeah.
I think that because Arya had been trained to be an assassin, that she knows exactly what Littlefinger is doing. Because she's trained to recognize every little nuance of the way a person behaves. And I think that lends itself to, we don't see it, a conversation between she and Sansa.
But see,
But I
your
think we
sta-
needed to see it.
your statement right there explains the whole problem. We didn't see it.
I think, yeah, I mean, that's happened with both of their story. Like, I love Arya's storyline in the book in terms of her learning to become an assassin and all of that. Like, I think there's real complexity there in terms of her identity. I wish that the show took a more, like, specific arc with that because it kind of just had, like, they started there for sure when she first got to Bravos, but then we kind of just ended up with a lot of stick hitting and just sweeping, stick hitting, and then you're an assassin. But I wanted to see that. It's cool.
Yeah. I just want to point out because I mean I have really complicated feelings about Sansa and Arya, and I have since like 2003 when I first read the books. Because my sister was like, she read them first. She was like, Arya's such a good character, and I was like, Sansa though. So
means it's
that's my
true.
relationship with my sister in a nutshell. But she did introduce me to the books. This is not about that. I feel very strongly that George values Sansa's journey in a way that the show does not, and I think that he not disvalue. I think he sees what Arya's story actually is in a way that the show does not also. I think that it's really naive for us to be like, it's so great that she's going to murder people, and she does it with this look of rapture on her face when she cuts Walter Frey's throat and like feeds his sons to him. I'm like, this is awesome. Like, no, it's not awesome. Like,
a terrifying moment.
Killing might be necessary, and I'm not saying it's at all bad that Arya can kick ass and defend herself and like, whatever. But there's a lot of complexity there and a lot of bad shit that is going on in Arya's mind that I don't think the show cares about because it just looks cool and everybody's like, oh, the list. Like, no, the list is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It is very much so.
Yeah.
A lot of these characters have
They're-
PTSD.
Oh, yeah.
Right. They're both.
Yes.
Basically, her story becomes Lady Stoneheart's story. Yeah.
Story is false Arya's story.
Yeah.
Right.
But I don't think that Michelle McLaren and I can't remember the name of Denise Taylor or something like that.
Yeah.
The
The
writer,
Vanessa
writer,
Taylor.
Vanessa Taylor. Yeah.
Vanessa.
those two would have been so dimensionalized
Yeah.
where they had been going before
Mm.
and be more like George's. But Dave and Dan were well the veil's just not visual enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think
Yeah.
that's the problem. Also, is like, sorry, like you can't like Lady Stoneheart. George talks about this, and like I think that it's fine to like. I mean, it's sad to cut it, but I think at the end of the day, she is still like a mindless zombie, and that's like who she is. But then when you put those traits onto a character who's not that and is supposed to like just still be a normal like multi-dimensional character, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's our friend in the
Going back to Arya's training, my least favorite warrior woman in the show is the Waif.
Oh my god, yeah.
Yeah, she was awful.
I mean, even though she's pretty ambiguous in the books, the way I interpreted her was that she was always just she was
Yeah.
Training.
for Arya. And then to make her this mindless, I'm
It's insane.
no matter what.
I hate you, kind of.
Right.
Yeah, she
For
just
no
hated
real
it.
reason, yeah.
And have Jaqen Hagar just be like, you know,
That's
Yeah,
fine.
whatever, yeah.
Which is like
that was so against the
exactly it's
The
the,
waif in
opposite
the book,
point of
yeah.
what they're.
Yeah.
But it's even the opposite of what they're establishing in the show. Like everything Arya is supposed to not be doing, the waif is doing,
Right.
and not getting in trouble for it. So
Right.
it just made no sense. I
But
think
what,
they-
but what did make sense was when Arya ended up killing the waif instead of the other way around. I think that's why Jaqen accepted it, because not only did the waif fail in assassinating Arya, but that the waif kind of deserved it, right?
Yeah.
And so Jaqen was like, "Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
she deserved it."
Was basically doing everything
See ya.
that I was teaching you not to do. So
yeah.
Yeah.
right.
Well, I think they
Right.
just don't understand the concept of the faceless men on the
Yeah,
show.
I mean,
so.
that's the
Well,
whole
yeah,
thing,
they
right?
kind
Like,
of don't. Yeah.
The whole problem is that a lot of the concepts in the book are like,
Lost in
are
stuff.
exactly like you get the what happened, but you don't get any of the why or the how or the like why this makes sense or why it's supposed to make you think. You know.
Yeah. And I get it. I mean, I get there's some things that you can't translate to the
Yeah.
screen. There's just some you're in somebody's head. You really can't translate
Yeah.
somebody's thoughts onto a screen. But there's just ways that they could have interpreted things differently that probably would have given you that's why such and such is happening, that they chose not to.
The
And
pri-
sort
the
of thing, like
price
that line that Brienne gave at some point to Jamie, where she was like, "Oh, you lost your hand and now you're blubbering like
Oh
a
my
woman."
God.
Brienne would never say that.
Yeah.
Also using the
like-
C word.
She,
like,
all of them always use the C word, especially.
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
I think Yara is like the worst culprit of this adaptation problem on the show because it's like literally like the opposite in terms of Asha's like one of the few characters, especially warrior characters, just because she's been through it longer and like has a little bit of power in the system compared to the others, like where she actually expresses in her chapters what she feels about the system and how she's working against it. And then in the show we get like the ultimate like toxically masculine representation of her, and it just
yeah,
E-
Arya.
even to the point of making her like be like this really aggressive lesbian.
yeah. I
on
mean
top of
she's
that, you know what I
she's
mean?
a rapist because she
wrong with
was
that, but-
kissing a sex slave, so there was no consent there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. yeah.
It's
Well,
also-
it's not. I mean, I can't recall in the book if she is sort of bi-curious, but I think she's just sort of open-minded sort of thing. But you know, she's always been one to be like, you know, not going to force herself on other people
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
the sort of
Her
thing, just because
sexuality
of her
is
position of who she
super,
is.
yeah, even if it's like straight in the
Fluid,
book,
yeah.
it's like really interesting because it's one of the few times we see women have actual power and agency
Or
within their
agency.
sexual relationships.
Because
Or
she
enjoy
has
it.
She
Yeah.
has like a lover in the book that
Yeah.
is just like some guy, and she's like, you know,
I like
whenever I'm
sex.
ready for you, just
Yeah.
come to whenever you're ready, you just, you know, I'll just come.
Yeah.
So it's like it's there's a lot of sense, like you brought up how Cersei's probably like one of the biggest misogynists in the whole show.
Oh,
yeah.
And she
completely.
kind of is. I mean,
Yeah.
she just, you know, but it's also still a factor of she's growing up in this patriarchal society. She had no female role model really because her mother was dead. And so her model was Tywin. And so it's sort of, you know, she uses her femininity and her sexuality in a manipulative way, which is not always a bad thing, you know, when you need to, but in her instances, it's almost always a bad
Yeah.
thing.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
the first time she had that experience was with Jamie, and then she was like, I can make him do whatever I
Everything,
want.
right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, well, let me
Yeah.
use that again.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Jamie gave up basically his entire life to be with her, and then she goes and marries Robert, and he's just sort of like, you know, now what? So, it, you know, I think every woman in the show and in the books just sort of knows their role and gets their role, and the difference I think between the two is how it's viewed on the show, how they're interpreting their roles, and how it's done in a book. You know, yeah. A lot of it is a characterization. Like the
framing,
Cersei in the show, I love Lena Headey. and she plays Cersei amazingly.
But it's not Cersei.
But it's not Cersei.
Yeah.
So it's Cersei. It's show Cersei. I mean, and there's nothing wrong. I mean, I know some people online call her Carol because that's not Cersei.
yeah,
that's Carol.
my website calls her that.
But yeah. And so, and I love her, and I think the way she portrays show Cersei is amazing for her portrayal. But if you wanted the actual interpretation of the Cersei in the book, she's nowhere to be found.
And I think the problem is they think they're still doing that. So like the way other characters talk about Cersei, it's as if she's like as bad as book
Right.
Cersei, but then she's not doing any of those
Right.
things.
And I mean, just the very fact that she basically blew up a sept. In essence,
It's fine.
she blew up a church, killed thousands of people, her own people, killed a queen, basically sort of
all
traumatized
good.
her son to the point where he killed himself.
it's all good.
And then she just takes the throne and everybody just goes, yeah, all right.
No problem.
Like,
what are small folk? What are
Where
people?
where would that ever happen? You know, and so just and she does it without even like thinking, and there's no real consequence to it. Whereas opposed in the book, she's probably plotting and planning something like that, but there would be a major consequence if she ever did anything.
Yeah,
like that.
and Cersei's book problem is that like she's always plotting and planning, but she thinks she's the smartest person in the room, and
And
she
she's
never
really
is.
dumb. Yes, she's actually very stupid.
That's implied in the show. It's implied in the show that she's.
Yeah,
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
imp-
Tywin's
I feel
told
like
her,
I feel like
well, you think you're
people
smarter
tell
than
her
you
that,
actually
but they
are.
frame her as being like still. I mean, because
But yeah, the
because
fact-
it followed through and she ended
Right.
up being queen.
I think
Her
the
actions
fact
are
that
rewarded.
they've kept her on probably longer than because everybody's going, why is Cersei even still
Because
alive?
they love Lena Headey,
And
which is
because they
fair.
love Lena Headey,
She's
which I
great.
can't blame them
Yeah.
for. But because they've cut out sort of major subplots from the books, it's kind of forced them to keep Cersei around much longer because they've made her this sort of dynamic villain that they have to face. And I'm like, no, in reality, she's really powerless. She has nothing.
Which is where the complexity is there.
right,
Really chastised after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
right.
But then they had that in the show, and then yet she comes right back. And
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
pretty freaky.
Yeah, and
I-
just like
yeah.
right, just like sort of shrugged it off and like, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
you know, whatever. So.
And then we end up in like the endless cycle of Cersei and Jaime, and it's like,
Right.
what is the breaking point?
Right.
Right. Well, I think it's worth talking in a broader sense about how both mediums portray and think about violence because, you know, even the title of this panel, like Warrior Women, I feel like you can interpret that in a couple different ways, right? Like
Yeah.
you can interpret that as like
a physical warrior versus like a
Right.
mental warrior.
right, and
yeah.
also just like women who are defined by being warriors, like they are often in the show, or you know, or not. But like, I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that like Cersei is capable of incredible violence. You know, I mean, she orchestrated that entire thing with very few allies and very few resources. You know, I think there was a lot of debate at the end of season 7 why Sansa wasn't the one who killed Littlefinger. You know, I saw some people saying like, oh well, the person who the man who passes the judgment should swing the sword, and I'm like, she's no man, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But you know, I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Because I think it's the women are kind of stuck in an interesting spot in that place.
I think it's because they have a very, like, the writers in the show have a very specific idea of what makes a strong woman.
You can even tell by the way that they're dressed.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, you
I
know,
mean, again, they're all wearing
yeah.
the same outfit now.
You know, right? I mean,
Um,
it's like everybody's in pants and leathers
Yeah,
and
I
armors,
put,
and
like-
like you know, Sansa's still in a dress, and Marjorie was still in a dress, and so like you know, the
And they're
thing-
all
well,
black.
well,
Everyone wears black
because
now.
winter's here. You know?
Um,
Yeah.
Wrestling with metal, I mean, Cersei's outfit has got
Yeah.
more and
Spikes
more
and, yeah.
Oh my God.
armor,
Yeah.
shoulder pads,
Right.
wide belt.
Right.
Remember at the
And so's
beginning,
and so's Danny's.
I
Yeah.
would wear the armor, and you would
Wear the dress.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting point because also, like, in terms of them understand, like, I had this moment, I think it was season 6, where there was just several scenes where I felt like I was watching the same scene over and over again with different characters, specifically with the women, where they would kill someone or do something really violent and smile and walk away. And yeah. And I'm like, this is not great. We're not supposed to be framing it this way. And Sansa specifically is a character where it's like, oh, they just don't understand that there's other ways that these women can be powerful and also feel anger and feel all these things, but not necessarily have to relish in their violence.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I mean, it's. I mean, if you have not read the books, And I know some people have problems even with the book version of Dorn. Like, why are we reading about Dorn? Dorn is
Love Dorn.
awesome. Number one.
It's
Dorn's
not my
great.
favorite.
It's
It's not my favorite either.
but it's just if you haven't read the books and you eventually do, and you see the difference in how Dorn is written versus what you saw for Dorn, especially women, because basically all the points of view, most of the points of view from Dorn are from a female.
Yeah.
And so it's just sort of like, so you get a sense of like, you know, I mean, they take lovers and they have no issues with bastards, and it's that was another problem I had with how they did Dorn, is that it's absolute primogenitor, so the first child
Oh my God. But
gets it.
Women don't exist.
So it was a princess of
Which
Dorn.
is
The
a
next
huge
person
plot point
was
in the
supposed
book.
to
It's
be
the
a
only
woman.
plot. It's the plot point.
It's one of the major plot points. So I mean, yeah, it was like a huge plot point in the book that it's absolute primogenitor in
yeah,
Dorn.
it's
So-
about crowning women and then using specifically Marcella to crown her. But
To
then
crown her,
no,
right.
let's kill her.
Yeah, so it's
Same
so,
thing.
so it's just, and it just, the way that it's actually begins to make you angry, because you're kind of like, you did a huge disservice,
Yeah.
which could have been I mean you're bringing in, first of all, really your first real representatives of color that you've seen, and these are females of color now, and that you just basically completely destroyed what they're supposed to represent.
Yeah, and I think that's where
Yeah.
Ariane's perspective is really important, because we get everyone's view of Dorn from other characters. So like Tyrion, we see Oberyn, and everyone has this really stereotypical view of what these people are, and they're people of color, and they're also queer people, and it's all about like sex and being really violent. And then we get inside Ariane's head, and it's so not that.
So not that.
And there's a real complexity there, and it's finally shedding light on the fact that there is a lens there that is there for a reason. And I think that when having the show Dorn, we went in the opposite direction. I guess, did they just like not read the Ariane chapters and listen to all of the crazy bullshit that everyone else perpetuates about Dorn? Because it seems like that's what that was.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most, I'm not a huge fan of Dorn, but I think that like because I mean, well, to be fair, we get there pretty late,
Problematic
and
in its
it's
own
fair.
way.
yeah. But I think and God knows Doran has plenty of his own issues, but like him talking about the water gardens and wanting to preserve the innocence of these children who are both noble and lowborn, like that's really important thematic stuff. That is like, and like, it's not that I need that to be in the show, but that sensibility is
Right.
very valuable, and
Right.
it's completely absent, and then completely like extra destroyed when the sand snakes just like charge in and are like, we
And
can
just
basically
right.
kill you with our eyes because it's super easy.
Yeah, I
Just
mean,
a little
and, it's,
stab
and,
Tario Ho ties
and they
down.
forget the fact that like this man is your family. This is
Yeah.
your
Oh, it
father's
doesn't-
brother, and you just went in and just
Oh,
killed
yeah.
him like for no reason.
Yeah.
And so
That's a huge
like
thing.
and the whole thing with like Oberyn telling Cersei like, we don't kill little girls in Dorne. Well, yeah, clearly apparently now you do.
I know,
So-
and I really like that line.
And they always they like used it a lot in the like recaps before the episodes in the in season 6 or whatever. And I was like, maybe don't stress the fact that you wrote this
That you-
before
that
if
you
you're gonna
kinda said
just
this.
turn around that.
Yeah.
And also, I think Ilaria, we talked about, is such a huge turnaround in her speech about revenge and why it's so bad and futile and what it means, and like countless violence and seeing people die for other people is not worth it.
Right.
And then just like have the entire storyline be about just
Her and
violence
her
and
her
killing
vengeance,
for the
yeah.
sake of vengeance.
Not even like I could even like they can change stuff. Like I
Yeah.
could even see her being like angry and wanting
Right.
to do something.
But then
Right.
frame
You
it
know,
as that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but like smart about it and
Right.
not taking it out on a child, and that's very
Right.
antithetical to
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's also the problem, because I don't necessarily have an issue. Like, I mean, I have an issue because I love Asha so much with them flipping like a 180 on Yara. But if they just framed what Yara was and what she was doing as being bad in the narrative and not something that we're supposed to see as cool as and empowering, then I wouldn't have so much of an issue with it.
right. Should we take questions in general now? Or?
Yeah, people have had their hands.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. I
Yes.
I can't believe how we forgot about.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
They're amazing also.
Yeah.
Who also, if you've never read the books, you don't know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
But
But I mean, there's that
The little
one
girl-
Yeah.
that
The little girl on the show.
is the epitome
Yeah,
of like.
she's-
yeah, the little one.
She's
I mean,
amazing, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
she's
because
Or
you.
like after 5 scenes, I was like, we get it. She has the only good opinions in this room. Why can no one else say things?
I know. It's like, can we get it? Like, can we talk? Yeah. So the Manderley family in general is just badass. The whole family. So it you know, when you see him in the show, he's just sort of some lord that's kind of among other lords, and you don't see kind of his family, but he has daughters and granddaughters who are just fantastic, and who are loyal to the Starks, loyal to the North, and we're like, you know, we're not supporting the Lannisters, we're not supporting Stannis, this is bullcrap, and would say it like publicly, point blank, we're not doing this, this is wrong, and you know, the Manderleys, you know, there was the whole, oh, and we're also forgetting Lyanna Mormont, but I'm forgetting.
Yeah, it's
I'm
easy
talking
to
about the
mix up,
Manderleys,
yeah,
but I'm
yeah.
talking about the Manderleys.
Because
but,
they gave the
but Lyanna,
Lyanna
but there-
Manderley
yeah.
or
So
whatever,
the only Mormont you saw in the show was Lyanna, who was badass in the book, and she's badass in the show. But there are other Mormont women,
Yeah.
and so. And I'm gonna go out on a limb here and be the tinfoil person, and I still think Tormund is the father of what's the name of his kids. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yes.
and the Mormont women also are much closer to like the have it all type. You know, like
Yeah.
they are mothers. They are, you know, like
Yeah.
who's
Yeah.
the mom? Dace. No,
Mage.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and she's like, yeah, I taught all my daughters how to fight, and they are, you know, Daisy is dancing at the red wedding right before she gets murdered, but you know,
Yeah.
like it's yeah,
She was
yeah,
Kingsguard,
yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and that I mean Bear Island is basically ruled by women.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
no
'cause their
sign
men
of a
are just
man.
great.
There's no sign of Mage's
Yeah,
husband.
they're
We don't know where like her daughters or father. They're
Yeah.
just all women. There's no sign of like a man. So
Yeah.
Jorah, and who's exiled and one of
and
who's
exiled
Castle
himself.
Black. Yeah. So I mean, it's basically ruled by women, and nobody questions this. Nobody
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
North is like, that's strange, that's odd, what's happening. Nobody questions it. It's just okay.
It is interesting though how like I mean I would actually maybe contest that slightly because I think that there is a slight amount of like those Mormonts on that island.
Like,
Well,
you know,
yeah,
like-
view it is weird, but
yeah,
it's sort of
but
like
it's not right. It's not
Yeah.
transgressive.
Right.
But it's yeah.
Yeah, they recognize that
Like,
they're
there's-
still like powerful women. They're just like,
Yeah.
that's weird because the rest of us
Right.
don't do that.
Right.
Yeah, like we can like, oh, what's happening on there?
Like,
but
we'll
nobody
still let them
questions
fight for
their
us,
power,
but
nobody
yeah.
questions their
Nobody's like, I'm
authority.
going to go over and set that to right.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
like, you know, no, a man needs to be in charge here. Like, you know, you have no right to this, you have no this, you have no that. Everybody's just like, that's weird, but all right,
Yeah.
you know.
By the way, thinking about warriors, John says, well, we want everybody over the
Oh,
age of
yeah.
10
Boys and girls.
to get training in archery and
Yeah.
how to hold a sword and stuff like that. And what's his name? Glover stands up and says, you're going to put a spear in the head of my granddaughter?
And Leanna's like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, we can't be worried about, like, little, like, you know, girls can't fight. You know, we're looking at Armageddon here.
In
She
the
can't
book,
really,
in the
you know.
book,
Can't
he
even
has.
defend herself, really?
Yeah, exactly.
In the
She's-
book, he has a moment like that too, and like another like little girl's like, I want to fight, and then he's like, oh wait, am I sexist if I don't let her fight?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. He's like, oh yeah, he
It's like
learned a
whenever it's
lot
her.
among the wildlings,
Yeah.
like a lot.
How
Yeah.
amongst the children, like highborn children in castles, a girl of 14 is like a child, but among wildlings, that is like a grown woman.
She's an adult.
Yeah.
You know, so basically they're being taught how to fight. The North and Dorne actually have a lot in common. So they're not, you know, I mean, in
Harsh
some
climates.
parts of the North, I should say, where they're not afraid to teach their females how to fight. They don't really, you know, it might be unusual, but they accept when a female is in power. Like the wildlings have female heads of their clans, and
Yeah, I would say it's like
So-
wildlings or like specifically the Mormonts, but you can tell like with the Starks even that's not really something that they would want their daughters to do because
do.
as
Yeah,
great
no.
and supportive as like Ned is,
Yeah.
you know that that's not the future he
Yeah.
wants for Arya.
I'm assuming he's
presume-
gonna like,
and
well,
that's
she'll
what
grow out of
Lyanna
this
wants it
eventually.
And
probably.
exactly, and like Lyanna clearly also didn't necessarily want a specific feminine coded role in society, but
Right.
and that wasn't accepted.
Right.
She had
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah.
She's been waiting a long time.
Oh.
So, one of the things I think is actually an improvement in the show is the interpretation of Shay. Shay's
Well, yeah.
look annoys me, you know, and I feel like the dynamic that they added to her in the show made it so much more tolerable.
Yeah. Well, they made their whole relationship more,
Yeah.
an actually real relationship. Whereas in the book, you're sort of like Tyrion. You you're reading way
Well,
more into
Tyrion's
this than is
just-
actually
yeah,
going on.
yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
Shay in the
So-
books is functioning, I think, on a very base level
Yeah.
of survival.
Yes.
And that is why she's not a nice person.
Yeah, and I think that
you
she
know.
I think she also is
trying not to
specifically
die
going
here.
into the relationship knowing that it's a transaction. It's not a
Right.
relationship versus in the show it's clearly something that they both are feeling.
Yeah.
Right.
And she's really good at it. I mean, like, you
Yeah.
read those chapters again, and she is, like, literally pressing every single button
Yeah.
that Tyrion has.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. She knows exactly like
Yeah,
which buttons.
it's
to push,
actually
yeah.
Shay's an interesting one because I feel like while we were watching them together, like it was way more entertaining watching them when they both feel things, but then they kind of got in like a little sticky area once the trial stuff came up because there was a differing in terms of her characterization.
Well,
But
that
then
made
they,
her betrayal so
Yeah.
much worse, even more for the viewer. I think I don't think anybody in the books really like is rooting for Shay.
Right.
And then the show, it was much
and
more
it's
like,
like
wait,
harder
why?
because she
Yeah.
betrays Sansa too, and
Yeah.
like that felt
Right. And she
worse
has
for
to.
me.
Of course, she has to. Like, she's being threatened.
She's being
and, you
basically
know.
Yeah,
threatened,
she has no
but,
choice
yeah.
Yeah.
or agency in the situation.
And so it's, yeah.
Back here.
You think that the warriors or the women in the north is more because of necessity, because they have so many reigns coming, that it's more acceptable that they are warriors and nobody questions?
It could be.
Defend yourself.
What,
But
right, there
But
are well, in the Mormont case, there weren't any men
Mormont,
around.
yeah.
Right,
yeah, to interpret.
In
but
the
you
far
figure in
north,
in
the subsistence
subsistence.
nature of it,
Yes.
maybe,
Yeah.
may have contributed to that.
With Asha
Mm.
in the wagon when they're going with Stannis' camp, and she gives her a compliment like, "Oh, that's cool, you're a warrior, women there too," and then she kind of gets all upset, and it's like, "Well, we're what you made us."
Yeah.
The Iron Men raid.
Right, they get raided
I
by
love that
there, and they get raided by
relationship. It's so
wildlings and stuff
interesting.
like that. But you figure they get yeah. I mean, they probably a lot of it is out of necessity. Like, we can't rely on these guys 'cause they go out foraging, they go out hunting, they go out raiding, and somebody else may come. We have to still be able to defend ourselves, defend our children, defend our village.
Yeah, it's worth
So,
noting
yeah.
though that there are many stories, particularly like the Belle the Bard stories in Winterfell, where like, oh, the Princess of Winterfell was kidnapped by a wildling.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just decided that she was like, yeah, screw this, I'm going. So it's, I mean, and it happens I think in villages in the Vale, they get raided by wildlings, stuff like that.
Yeah, the
You don't
the mountain men, yeah.
You don't necessarily hear that the females there are, sort of learning how to fight, but it probably happens much more often in the north, or at least it's, especially particularly in Bear Island, they're probably getting it from both sides, so they kind of really have no choice but to learn how.
And the men go off and they have to, like the women are left to defend the island.
Yeah, and then it becomes, especially in the times that they're living in, war was, when Robert was king, the last war was, well, they had little, I guess, sort of smaller wars during the time that Robert was king, but the last major war had been when he took over. And so, but you would think that, okay, once wars start, men are going to go off to fight. Who's going to be here to sort of protect whatever? So it almost just logically makes sense that why don't we teach the girls to fight so they can defend the castle and blah, blah, blah. But in a patriarchal society, that's just not what happens.
I really want the spin-off to be Bear Island.
Oh my god.
That would be great.
So there were some more hands in the back there, yeah.
One nitpick I've had with the show lately is that now that Sansa and Arya are reunited, every time they refer to like their old life, they only talk about Ned and they never bring up
Their mother.
Catelyn doesn't matter on the show.
No, that aspect.
I'm just kind of wondering what your viewpoints on that. Why would they? Is it because they're in a role now that maybe wasn't more traditionally like Catelyn's role as like the lady of Winterfell, more so that they're running the show, and so that's why they're looking back on Ned more so. But yeah, just wondering if you have any comments about that.
It's probably because they're having to do all the stuff that Ned used to do, and they
I think,
didn't expect
I
to
think,
do that.
yeah, the
Yeah.
problem, Colin did a lot of it in the books, and they completely, went over that in the show in terms of, even from the first season with Ned telling Catelyn to kind of get everything ready while he's in King's Landing because he knows that there's about to be an issue. She was the lady of the house, but that means that she has a lot of duties, especially when the Lord of the House is gone. She kind of takes that
She's in
role.
charge,
And I think because all of that was overlooked and a lot of Kat's political agency within even Rob's storyline was kind of given to Rob in that stuff, and she was seconded. I think that they don't really necessarily have even on the show stuff to then refer back to for the characters to be like, oh yeah, mom did this, because
Yeah.
they just never showed that.
I'm gonna say it's because the writers aren't thinking about Catelyn, so
Yeah.
the characters
They
aren't
don't think
thinking
about
about
Catelyn.
I also think that she's still kind of a bone of contention between the sisters.
Right, that's a good
that,
point.
That they don't necessarily view their mother's love the same way. So I'm sure that, you know, Arya to some degree probably still thinks her mother preferred Sansa. You know, and it's probably just a topic best not brought up because it's probably still like a sore spot.
Well,
for
they've
maybe
been getting
for the
along
both of
on
them.
everything else.
Yeah, so like, you know, it's not, you know, and it's kind of probably also a traumatic thing. I was there when she died, so, you know, it's probably just best not to talk about it.
I mean, they were there.
And they were both together, right?
Yeah, they
so,
both witnessed
yeah,
that,
that was
yeah.
something
But,
they can
Sansa's
bond
fault.
over.
Yeah, and it's shared trauma. That's another thing why they would be more likely to talk about it. And that's an aspect on the show which relates to the glorification of violence is that there's a lot of characters that have PTSD. Let's face it.
Yeah.
And
Like
so
everyone.
that really informs their thinking and the way they act and all that stuff. And you don't see it on the show. You just don't, not really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's it for us, but
Yeah.
thanks,
Sorry, I'm
thanks for
unfortunately
coming,
done.
everyone.
Thank you.